Hello, I'm Jane Abramson, and my talk is described as astounding developments in printing. Really, today we all rely on pictures, both to receive news and information in every aspect of our lives. An example of how important images are to us today, compare with old editions of the Times, which used to have a classified advert page on the front page, all in small type with no pictures. Today, at a glance on a newsstand, you can see what is in the news from the colour photos on the front page. We've come a massive distance from the early days of printing and the first newspapers containing illustrations. So in my story of the printing of images, I'm going to start by describing how very early illustrations were produced from the printing of woodcuts on a local scale, through to the technology to produce newspapers and the development of photography and moving pictures to the mass media of today. Later on as well, because this is Leeds after all, we're going to look at Leeds and how that played an important role in the history of the printing industry. In 1810, there were still only 8 printing companies in Leeds, but in the next 10 years, the numbers exploded. And by 1911, printing was the fourth largest employer, employing more than 8,000 people in the region of Leeds. Printing was once one of the city's most important industries. In addition, prominent local engineering companies manufacturing cutting-edge printing machinery and equipment. So let's go to the beginning then. Obviously, the history of printing goes back many centuries with the invention of the printing press by Gutenberg in Germany and William Caxton in England, for the written word mainly. So my starting point is looking at, I've been a volunteer guide at Kirk's Abbey for some time, and I've been exposed to lots of illustrations of the Abbey at that time. And I looked at this and this started me thinking, I knew this was a wood engraving, but how was it done? And how does engraving differ from etching? Well, that's quite straightforward because etching is even older, can be traced back to 1513, when the artist uses a needle and scratches onto a metal plate covered in wax using a chemical, usually acid. So etching is a chemical process, whereas engraving is a physical process. Limited supply of copies can be made. There are also lithographs, not used widely, where an artist draws onto stone with a greasy ink, but cannot produce many copies. So wood engravings developed for use in mass printing in Victorian times. The beginnings of modern wood engraving techniques developed at the end of the 18th and beginning of the 19th century with the works of Englishman Thomas of Bewick. Now, I'll just try and explain this fairly simply to you. Bewick generally engraved harder woods such as boxwood, cherry wood, or lemon wood. And he engraved the end of the block. You can see that that's flat on this particular example. This was easier so that instead of visible rings that can be cut across the grain, it's called an end grain block. Very important, so the engraver can move the tool in any direction without having to cut against the grain of the wood. To do this, he used something called a burin or graver, which is an engraving tool with a V-shaped tip. Now, there were a whole range of sizes of burins, from very fine to broad, to cut away the background and also to create thin, delicate lines. And you can see an early example of this, quite simply, of how this developed from that original engraving. So I've just shown you a brief modern idea from this, and this is showing you in more detail how it's done. So the engraver holds the wood in a small sand bag so it doesn't move around, starts to draw on the wood with a narrow pen with dense ink, and then he or she here has divided the drawing into areas to be engraved in different tones. And you can see there that where it's deeper, it's going to come out white because the ink won't touch that. So in that particular case, it comes out something like that. It's a very simple example, but it's just to show you how that would work. And you could imagine doing that. If we then look at some of these other engravings, here's Kurt Slabby again, and it's much more detailed, much finer as that was done. And another couple of examples. This is Fountains Abbey. they became very fashionable and popular, these engravings, and that one's Ripon Cathedral. So how could pictures be mass produced from engravings? Now, I just wanted to tell you this simply because clearly if you've got a block, it's not going to fit in with the printing press. So they've developed this system called electrotyping. So I'll explain it simply to you. The engraved surface of the woodblock was pressed into hard wax, making an impression that could be used as a mould. This mould was then dusted with black leading to provide an electrically conductive surface. The mould was placed in an electrolytic bath and a thin shell or skin of copper was deposited over the surface of the mould. The copper skin was then stripped off the mould, laid flat down in a tray and backfilled with type metal to give it strength. And the resulting metal electrotype, commonly called an electro, was then mounted onto a block of wood and printed alongside type. So in this way, many copies could be made and distributed. So this is really a step forward of illustrating type. I just go back for a moment here. So Thomas Bolton then had the idea in 1860 of sensitizing the surface of his woodblock on which a photograph was printed from a negative. He made his engraving through the photograph in the same way as if it was a drawing on the block, tracing through. That was the first effective step towards the final substitution of photography for draftsmanship. And by the end of the 19th century, engravers were dispensed with. So with this development of engraving for mass printing of illustrations, this led to the rapid development of illustrated magazines and newspapers. And this one here is Punch magazine. I don't know how many people remember Punch magazine, but it was founded in 1841 and it was the earliest mass printing. And this actually is edition 1 here. In its formative years, Punch aimed to combine humour, illustration and political debate in a radical way, which was quite audacious for its time. The idea originally came from an engraver called Ebenezer Landell, who was a huge fan of a satirical weekly magazine in Paris called Le Charivari. And he loved the magazine's use of wood engravings. So he wanted to produce a similar magazine in London. The early issues of Punch were more about politics than pictures, but I shall show you some in a moment. During the 1840s, it became much more famous for its radical writing and humour. And that said, each edition had Punch's pencilings, a full-page satirical drawing that appeared in the centre of the magazine. You can see what I mean here. This first one is called Substance and Shadow, and we've got here some very poor people at the bottom who've come in to have a look at these magnificent oil paintings of the aristocracy. So that's making a particular comment there, some little urchins around. And then this one is even more descriptive, Capital and Labour. And there's capital at the top with swags of money lying, being served by servants. Even dogs were treated better than people and staying in bed and being served by servants. And oh dear, down at the bottom, we've got labour and we've got these poor people, little urchins, they were probably hungry. So that's very evocative and typical of what Punch did at that particular time. And they couldn't have done that without the wood engraving technique. So we then move on to the next illustrator who joined Punch and succeeded as the principal political cartoonist was Tenniel. Now you may remember the name Tenniel. This is a couple of the political illustrations, the nemesis of neglect. And then I think that's Disraeli in a cupboard there, the cabinet trick. But you may have heard of Tenniel much more as an illustrator of Alice in Wonderland. And this was quite something at the time, very famous pictures done of Alice, all done with wood engraving again. And here's the Mad Hatter's Tea Party and the caterpillar with the hookah. So again, you can sort of see if you look closely how the wood engraving has been done on these. This one was interesting, which I found, and this was obviously when an engraver was working to the pictures that had been produced by Tenniel, and he's put things like "cut this away," lights on hair, arm, etc., and he's signed it. So that shows another way of doing it. So he was the artist, but then engravers would actually produce it onto the wood. And then there's a rather horrible one there of Jabberwocky, but he liked doing those as well. And then, very interestingly, we get on to the first national newspaper, world's first illustrated weekly news magazine, it was called, the Illustrated London News. And this started just the year after Punch, and it was founded by Herbert Ingram. First appeared on Saturday, the 14th of May, 1842, and this is the first copy here, as the world's first news magazine. This was an astounding innovation. It had 16 pages, 32 wood engravings covering many different topics, and the first front page featured an engraving at the bottom, which is described as the conflagration of the city of Hamburg. There must have been a terrible fire there at that time. This first edition was timed to feature the young Queen Victoria's first masquerade ball. Ingram hired 200 men to carry placards through the streets of London promoting the first edition of his new newspaper. It cost sixpence, probably about £3 today or more. The first issue sold 26,000 copies, and all illustrations were done by woodcuts. So I've picked out a few events to show you how this works, because I think it's very important in history as well. So here's the first one which I've picked out for you, which is the Preston Pans, the Preston riots of August 1842. This followed wage cuts of 25% and formed part of the Chartist campaign for more democratic politics. Now, clearly this is done in an imaginative way, but it does make people have a look at it and think, what is all this about? Another one here is the Crystal Palace, Joseph Paxton's designs in 1851. And this was in the Illustrated London News before even Prince Albert had seen the designs. It was this huge glass and iron structure originally built in 1851 for the Great Exhibition held in London's Hyde Park. Prince Albert, as head of the Society of Arts, had the idea of an exhibition to impress the world with Britain's industrial achievements. The next one is 1852. A special edition was produced covering the funeral of the Duke of Wellington. The Duke of Wellington's funeral in November 1852 was one of the most spectacular ever seen in England. The procession to St. Paul's Cathedral was watched by a crowd estimated at 1.5 million people in those days. A printed panorama over 66 feet long was published to commemorate the event. Then there was a significant development. In 1855, there was the abolition of the Stamp Act that taxed newspapers, and its sales went up 200,000 to 200,000 a week. The next picture is of the Crimean War. Here, artists in the field would send back little sketches of generalized scenes without much detail. I mean, clearly there wasn't somebody sitting there with an easel. So there was imagination in these pictures as well. Probably about 4 artists working on different sections of that picture at that particular time. This is a rather sad story. This was Jumbo the elephant, who was exported to Jardin des Plantes, a zoo in Paris, France, then transferred in 1865 to London Zoo. Jumbo was sold to P.T. Barnum, who runs circuses in the States, took him to America for an exhibition in March 1882. But he died in a rail accident in 1885, tripping and impaling himself with his tusk. Now I'm going to turn to Leeds events that were recorded, which just shows the sort of national, if not international, nature of the Illustrated London News. It wasn't just about London. And these are very interesting developments here. So we've got the first picture here is Queen Victoria visits Leeds in 1858 to open the town hall. So this was very carefully done. You can see all the people watching from behind the barriers. The Queen was probably in that big carriage there with the horses behind, and all these various decorations were put up, and special bridges and arches, really made a fuss of it. And there the party have arrived, and you can see a familiar picture of the front of Leeds Town Hall there, all recorded for the Illustrated London News. Then Prince Arthur visited Leeds in 1872 to officially open Roundhay Park. So they set up this big building with the steps going up with all the VIP guests and a guard of honour there. And on the way, there were these very ornate arches which the royal cortege passed through. So you get a real picture of what it was like in Leeds as well. Here's a famous picture of Mr. Gladstone in Leeds in 1881, talking about free trade to all the people there. And the last picture I've got of Leeds here is the opening of Leeds City Art Gallery in 1888. And this is interesting because it's got quite a few different pictures here of the stairs, which are still there, and the tiled hall and all the other sections. So again, people from all around the country could have bought an Illustrated London News and had a look at this. Now, I'm just going to talk to you about portraits that were done as well. Now, this is actually a picture of my great-great-grandfather, who's sitting in his chair there. He's called Thomas Dewell Scott, and he was a well-known illustrator. And his engravings of many of the most famous men of the 19th century appeared on a regular basis during a long career in the Illustrated London News in the late 19th century. So let me just show you. I can always tell which ones are his if I look at back copies of the Illustrated London News, because he had this monogram TS. But his work was amazing, and I've just given you a couple more examples here. Now, this is a copy in detail. You can see TS on just to the left of the shoulder on the engraving, and this is James Paget. But the work involved very carefully in doing all of this was quite remarkable. It may well have been copying from that photograph, but it's still very skilled work here. James Paget was an English surgeon and pathologist who's best remembered for Paget's disease. Then another one that T.D. Scott did was this one of Field Marshal Sir George Pollock, who was a British Indian Army officer. So clearly these pictures had to be taken from illustrations. They couldn't have been having the person sitting for the picture there. But he did 2 of these for every edition for a number of years. So that really created my interest, I suppose, to begin with, in all of this of the Illustrated London News. However, from about 1890, the Illustrated London News made increasing use of photography. The tradition of graphic illustrations continued, however, until the end of World War I. But the peak time for wood engraving and electrotyping to be replaced by photographs was 1880 to 1905. So sadly, the skills of engravers were superseded by technology. So I'm going to move on now to a different section about innovation, astounding innovations, and this is photography. Now, I expect many of you will be familiar with this earliest known photograph of the window at Laycock Abbey, which was taken by William Henry Fox Talbot. So that's quite remarkable. And I found this as well, Nelson's Column under construction, which is clearly a photograph, and it must have been not very much longer after that, because the Laycock Abbey was 1835 and Nelson's Column was built between 1840 and 1843. So this is clearly a very early photograph. Now, one of the ways of developing photography using cameras the earliest version really was the daguerreotype photograph, and it's quite complicated. I'll just go through very briefly so you can see how complex it was and how it led to developments in other ways for different ways of doing the camera. So basically what this daguerreotype process did, and it was only used in the 1840s and 1850s, it was quite a clever innovation at the time, but in retrospect quite complex. So it started with a sheet of silver-plated copper, polished to a mirror finish, treated with fumes that make its surface light sensitive, exposed in a camera for as long as judged necessary. On a very bright day, it would be for very couple of seconds, and a very dull day, it might be for quite a lot longer than that. The resulting latent image on it is made visible by fuming it with mercury vapor. And then it has to have liquid chemical treatment to rinse and dry it. Then it was quite delicate, so this easily marred image had to be sealed behind glass in a protective enclosure on a mirror-like silver surface. So they were sort of glass slides for this daguerreotype. So things moved on. I'm just going to mention in passing, because I believe there's another talk on this, about moving pictures, because that was clearly a magnificent development and had Leeds very much to the fore in this. So this is the world's first moving picture of traffic on Leeds Bridge in 1888. On YouTube you can get a little film of it, but it only lasts 2 or 3 seconds really. And another one I'll show you in a minute was done in Roundhay. So we do have a blue plaque on Leeds Bridge for Louis Laprince. He experimented in cinematography and patented one-lens camera with which he filmed Leeds Bridge, probably the world's first successful moving pictures. And there's another one here. Again, if you look on YouTube, you can sort of see those people dancing around in a circle. And that's clearly the style of a lot of Roundhay old houses there. So that was very interesting. Yes. Now, I'm not sure, this is a 16 lens camera, but I found this that was used as well when he experimented further. Anyway, the story of Louis Laprince is rather mysterious because he was born in France and he had the advantage when young of regularly visiting Jacques Daguerre, a friend of his father. But he mysteriously disappeared in 1890 and he was never seen again. So I'm going to go on to talk more about cameras now in the theme of photography and illustrations, astounding inventions. In 1879, George Eastman took out a patent for the first machine to coat sheets of glass with sensitive photographic emulsion. And he had patents for the first photographic film, and it was filed in 1884. And this was the one that superseded the daguerreotype. And by far the most significant event in the history of amateur photography was the introduction of this original camera in 1888, which sold for $25. It was invented and marketed by George Eastman, a simple box camera loaded with 100 exposure roll of film. When the roll was finished, the entire machine was sent back to the factory in Rochester, where it was reloaded and returned to the customer while the first roll was being processed. Although the Kodak was made possible by technical advances in the development of roll film and small fixed focus cameras, Eastman's real genius lay in his marketing strategy. To underscore the ease of the Kodak system, Eastman launched an advertising campaign featuring women and children operating the camera and coined the memorable slogan, "You press the button, we do the rest." By simplifying the apparatus and even processing the film for the consumer, he made photography accessible to the millions of casual amateurs with no particular professional training, technical expertise, or aesthetic credentials at all. The original Kodak was fitted with a rotating barrel shutter technique to this model. The shutter was set, you can see in the nearest to us, a little piece of string that's sticking out there. The shutter was set by pulling up the string on the top of the camera, and it was operated by pushing a button at the side of the camera, which we can't see on this picture here. After taking the photograph, a key on the top, you can see that, was used to wind the film onto the next frame. So these became quite collector's pieces, actually. It's one of the things to collect. I'll tell you about another one in a minute. Within a few years of Kodak's introduction, snapshot photography became a national craze. Various forms of the word Kodak entered common American speech, like Kodaking, Kodakers, and Kodakery. And amateur camera friends formed clubs and published magazines to share their enthusiasm. By 1898, just 10 years after the first Kodak was introduced, one photography journal estimated over 1.5 million roll film cameras had reached the hands of the amateur shutterbugs, as they were called. Then we get on to the Kodak Brownie camera. This is very different. This was just $1, cost far less, and reached the middle class by 1900. This really took off for a while. You can see the little brownies in the top. And as he again said here, Eastman, any schoolboy or girl can make good pictures with one of the Eastman Kodak's Brownie cameras. So again, marketing that as very simple to use. Now, the next picture is of a Leica camera, one of the very early ones from 1925. This was the first camera to use 35mm film, and it was much easier to carry around. It was easily portable, no need for a tripod, which there had been for the big cameras before. And this changed photography for good. It had a superb lens, and it was the model for all future development of cameras. Now, I was watching the Antiques Roadshow last night, and they had on one of these Leica cameras, and it was valued at £20,000. Absolutely amazing. So avid collectors of these items now. But in the development of photography, this was very important because it was small, it was compact. People could move it around for the first time, just take pictures as and when they saw things happening or something interesting to photograph. So this really was a game changer, as they call it. Now, just a little bit about photojournalism. We've been talking about the image and how important that is. And this was born in the 1920s when the printing technology was mature enough to support mass production. And as I mentioned before, the capabilities of the Leica made a new form of photojournalism possible. And so many photographers that view their work throughout the world, looking at different things and sort of like how the other half lives, that kind of thing. During the 1930s and 40s, picture magazines thrived, such as these ones you can see, The Picture Post and Life. They had enormous status and were able to mold public opinion. They were very popular. The one on the left is 1939 and the one on the right is from 1948. So photojournalism really flourished with picture magazines, but decline in popularity started in the 1950s, and the Picture Post closed in 1957 and others in 1958. I guess in some ways television had started to take over, and many advertisers abandoned the picture magazines, and by the 1970s, photojournalism had lost most of its influence. So then there's the rise of digital cameras, which is all we think about today. How things have moved on in just 30 years or even less. This was the very first Dicam 1990 digital camera. Initially with Sony able to convert images into digital data onto floppy disks. But then Logitech produced the first digital camera that took only black and white and 32 stored images. But progress was amazingly rapid with this. Cameras dropped in price. And by 2010, most smartphones had integrated digital cameras. So people carrying separate cameras around every day was becoming a thing of the past. So in this first section here, mass communication, as I said at the beginning, is practiced in multiple media: radio, television, social networking, billboards, newspapers, magazines, books, and the internet. I mean, you just look at all of that range there. Mass communication is used to disperse information at an accelerated rate, often about politics and other charged topics. We are bombarded by it. Now, I'm going to do a little section here on the history of printing in Leeds, because having reviewed the force of the image, I want to look at printing companies in Leeds. And if you remember, I said right at the beginning, in 1810, there were only 8 printing companies, but they were really large numbers by 1911. So I'm going to have a look at the Leeds Mercury, first of all. And this was very early, it was produced by John Hurst, the first known printer in Leeds, who began printing this in 1718. And it's one of the foremost provincial newspapers, publishing articles by many distinguished writers and gaining a reputation as a leading reporter of liberal politics. So it lasted a very long time. In 1801, it was purchased by Edward Baines, a young liberal and nonconformist printer who used the newspaper to campaign tirelessly for moderate social and political reform. It started as a 4-page Saturday newspaper, gradually increased in size and popularity, and from 1861 was published daily, with the circulation expanding to more than 5,000 copies per week. So how were these produced? Well, on printing presses. Now, I apologise for the quality of this next picture, but it is important because Otley is famous for the Wharfedale press, and they revolutionised the printing industry. The first Wharfedale was built in 1856, and thousands have been made since then. At the time of the invention of the Wharfedale, engineers throughout the world were seeking ways of improving current printing presses. Little progress had been made, but it was the genius of David Payne of Otley who made the real breakthrough, a stop-cylinder machine that could deliver print without having to be stopped. It's now in the archives of the Otley Museum. This is worth a visit if you're interested. Printing machinery at Bradford Industrial Museum. This has got a very interesting collection of early printing presses on view, from the simple stanhope press of 1800 to the rotary printing press. There were large printing businesses in Leeds, as we've been mentioning. You may have heard of some of these. There was John Waddington, E.J. Arnold, Alfred Cook, also Chorley and Pickersgill, Beck and Inch, Poles, Polestar, Petty's, and Jowett and Sowery. So I'm just going to tell you a little bit about each of those. So John Waddington, this is a plaque that's still up now, started their printing business, printing posters for the theatre company around 1900, then expanded into board games, particularly Monopoly and Cluedo. The first UK edition of Cluedo was launched in 1949. And also there became a real craze for playing cards of all different sorts. So if you had some Waddington's playing cards, you may well still find some in the drawer. But they entered this due to a massive boom in demand for them. It was so high that in the 1920s, a new factory was built in Keighley, producing 30,000 packs of cards with single colour backs. And they also remain one of the biggest printing companies in Britain. In 1924, they produced the largest poster ever created, a 10-foot by 40-foot advertisement for the British Empire exhibition. At the outbreak of the Second World War, Waddingtons were asked to produce low-denomination banknotes valued at 2 and 6pence and 5 shillings to replace coins. This was an extremely high security operation with few people knowing about it. The notes never entered circulation and at the end of the war were destroyed. They did, however, produce foreign banknotes under an agreement with De La Rue in London, whose factory was bombed. Famously, Monopoly sets were sent to prisons of war held by the Nazis, which secretly contained maps, compasses, and real money in order to help them to escape. By 1993, John Waddington Limited employed 2,700 people in Leeds and exported their printing products all over the globe. Monopoly was sold to Hasbro in 1994 for around £55 million. Then E.J. Arnold, we've got a blue plaque for this one, Britain's leading educational suppliers and printers, established in a Georgian merchant's house in Briggate in 1870. Its warehouse and factory was in Blades Yard. So there we have it for E.J. Arnold. This was founded in 1863 by Edward James Arnold, a Dorset man, in Barnstaple in Devon. In 1870, he transferred the business to Leeds in order to broaden its scope, and shortly after this move decided to develop a trade with local schools, taking advantage of changes in the structure of education resulting in the 1870 Act. Within his lifetime, the company became the largest in the field for educational publishing. And I read, if you're over 20, it's likely you used E.J. Arnold exercise books at school. So certainly that back page there with arithmetic tables was around for a long time. So that was E.J. Arnold. The next one, most notable printers, was Alfred Cook's. It was the world's largest print works at the time and enjoyed royal patronage. The building was established here in 1866 on Hunslet Road. Alf Cook's expanded into colour printing in 1868 and moved his operation to Hunslet in the early 1870s. In 1885, Cook was appointed by Queen Victoria as Her Majesty's colour printer, and in 1890 he was Mayor of Leeds. Then we've got Petty's, officially launched in 1865 by John William Petty at a Leeds base, and he became one of the UK's preeminent printers. And in the 19th century, the strong Methodism and temperance principles of the Petty family helped the business to grow as they produced for the Band of Hope and other similar movements. In the 1970s, 1980s, Petty's was the go-to printer for the big run projects for television listings. They coordinated the UK-wide printing, binding and distribution of TV Times and Radio Times using other printers in the BPCC magazine and catalogue division of the Radio Times. The Christmas edition of the Radio Times in 1988 sold 11,220,666 copies, with all the extra pages for adverts plus the extended holiday programmes. The old building of what became Polestar Petty's closed in 2014 and 250 people lost their jobs. The building off Whitehall Road in Hunslet was destroyed by fire in 2016 and then demolished. The Electric Press building, which is quite iconic in Leeds, was built in 1894 for the firm of Chorley and Pickersgill, a printing firm who produced work on an occasional basis for London Transport, the LNER and many others. Then there's Beck and Inchbolds at Bond Street, were known for producing war propaganda posters. And finally, you can see the printing presses going like mad here at Polestar Petty's press machine. Just a word about the fate of small printing companies. I recently spoke with a relative who worked in a number of small printing companies through a long career in printing in Leeds. He started in the business in 1948 as a 15-year-old apprentice and moved several times to other small businesses, later joining Jowett & Syrie, a large printing firm. He told me the printing industry was strongly unionised and all workers were expected to join the union, although good relations were maintained with the employers. All work in printing was highly skilled mechanical typesetting by compositors, setting letters into iron frames that could print up to 8 pages at a time. At Jowett & Syrie, he was in a team of 5 compositors, producing a 40-page monthly magazine. He said that 50 men engaged in mechanical typesetting would later be replaced by 4 women using high-tech printing of superb quality. Basically, the printing industry was decimated by new technology. Many people lost their jobs. Small firms in particular suffered. A large number of printing companies have closed down over the last few years in Leeds, and that's mirrored across the country. People have so many places to buy cheap printing, which these firms just could not compete with. The very high level of skills of compositors has been lost. So what's the conclusion to this talk? Images play an important role in mass media. When we read a newspaper, either in paper or online, we look at the pictures first, probably, before reading the text. These images give viewers a broader perspective and clearer understanding of events than mere words are able to convey. Today, it is understanding of these events that it's difficult to find a story in the media that's not directly associated with at least one image. This is simply how news is presented in the modern media. Culture's also changed. Changes have taken place in the concept of privacy, especially in social media, with smartphones everywhere recording every event as it takes place. The Queen was reported a few years ago to say everywhere she went, she faced a barrage of phones rather than people themselves. People, of course, can do their own colour printing on a PC at home. However, there will always be a role for printing, but it will require different skills. We don't know where this will take us in the future. So we've had a look at the astounding developments in printing so far. And that's the end of the talk.